So this talk is in several parts. Um, I have an outline here, but as all talks go, maybe they will go away from the outline. A talk, as anything else, is like a dependent arising. The talk arises dependent upon circumstances and conditions, and so it's not me giving the talk; it's us giving the talk, really. And this talk is about training the mind for freedom. And so I want to start very simply, well, with the world. Start with the world that we're actually living in. And I don't mean abstractly. I mean this world right now. And if we look honestly, what we see immediately is suffering. Not just somewhere far away, not just in the future that may or may not come to pass, but it's suffering that's already here, present, and in many ways, in many cases, more suffering is coming, and it's coming fast. But we need to be very careful with that word suffering, because not all suffering is the same. To be born as a human being is to be born is to experience pain. There's pain in birth, there's pain in sickness, injury, loss, aging, and there will be pain eventually in death. That part is it's unavoidable. No one escapes it, not even the Buddha escaped it. This is the pain that comes with having a physical body that reacts, a physical body living in a physical world, a body that gets sick, a body that gets hurt, that ages, that dies. That pain is it's hardwired in, it's built in, it's cooked in. There's no practice that removes it. But then there's something completely different, something else. And this is what we actually have to talk about. And this is actually what we have to work with. There's an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, far more than what automatically comes with being embodied, far more than what has to be here. And when we ask why this unnecessary suffering exists, we can come up with this long list of explanations: politics, economics, history, technology, psychology, culture, and all of that matters. But if we keep looking and we keep simplifying, eventually we'll land on something very basic, something fundamental. Unnecessary suffering comes from greed. Unnecessary suffering comes from aversion, from craving, from resistance, from essentially from this mind and body, this nervous system wanting things to be a certain way and then not wanting them to be the way that they are. And if we want to see this playing out clearly, vividly, viscerally, you really don't have to look very far. You can just look at the current state of this country. You can look at our political culture. You can look at this administration. You can look at the president. And I want to be very clear about this, because this isn't about one uniquely bad person. It's not about good people versus bad people. It's not even about this moral outlier. What we're seeing is the same greed and aversion that lives in every human mind. The the craving for power, the fear of loss, the resistance to discomfort, the the need to dominate, control, defend, and secure a very fragile sense of self. The difference is simply in scale, in invisibility. In this present, an untrained mind has been given enormous power, constant amplification, and endless reinforcement. And so the dysfunction that exists quietly, sometimes loudly, in all of us becomes apparent and impossible to ignore. Greed shows up as self-aggrandizement. Aversion shows up as blame, hostility, retribution. Craving for affirmation, resistance to accountability, fear dressed up as strength. And when those those forces that are within each of us are operating at the highest levels. The consequences ripple outward. Division deepens, fear gets normalized. Entire groups of people get reduced to threats. Truth gets bent in service of desire. Institutions strain, they erode. And it's very tempting to say, this is because of him, but that misses the point. What we're what we're witnessing isn't an anomaly. It's actually a mirror. It's greed and aversion in the human mind, unexamined, untrained, but playing itself out on a national stage. And that's uncomfortable because it means we don't get to locate the problem entirely outside of ourselves. The same structure that we're seeing most visibly and viscerally is at work within each of us on a smaller scale with fewer consequences, but the same pattern. And I want to say that things go my way. I want I don't want to feel threatened. I don't want to feel diminished or wrong or afraid. And when those impulses aren't understood, when they're not examined, aren't trained, they don't stay small. They expand. They turn into rhetoric, policies, laws, actions that harm other people. And then when the consequences of greed arise, what follows is aversion, fear, aggression, defensiveness, retaliation. To protect the same fragile sense of self, the same identity, we become willing to dismiss suffering, justify cruelty, normalize dehumanization, and this isn't new. This is how suffering has always scaled up. It starts with the untrained impulse to simply seek pleasure and avoid pain, and with the failure to see that this impulse, left unchecked, becomes destructive. And because we see it everywhere, it becomes normal. It becomes assumed, just assumed way of being a human. Our systems reflect that. Our politics reflect it. Our media reflects it. We give lip service to compassion and justice, but when fear is activated, the deeper rule takes over. Protect yourself, protect your side, win, and let others suffer. This situation, it exists largely because many people don't know that there's an alternative. They don't know it's possible to be free from suffering without domination, without exploitation, without scapegoating, without endless craving and resistance. But you do. Those of you who are here listening at least have some sense that there's another way of being that's possible, that peace doesn't require the world to bend to your will. And this is exactly what the Buddha was pointing to. Not a political solution, not a utopian system, but just simply training of the mind and heart so that greed and aversion no longer rule the show. Because when they stop running the show here, they stop being projected out there. And that's where real change actually begins. And it begins by bringing us to where this is always becomes very real, to practice. So when people actually sit down to meditate, almost immediately the same question comes up: distractions, external distractions, internal distractions, noise, thoughts, sensations, emotions. And most people assume the problem is the distractions, but that's not really quite right. Distractions aren't just inevitable, they're actually immensely useful. They're part of this training of the mind and heart. We could spend our entire lives trying to find perfect conditions, the quietest room, the most controlled environment. And sure, that really can help a little bit, but even if you eliminated every external distraction, what would you be left with? You'd still be left with the inner ones, thoughts, memories, plans, worries, all of the countless sensations in the body, emotional currents. And if you look closely, you'll probably notice something very interesting. Outer distractions are often easier to work with than inner ones. And isn't that your experience? A car alarm goes off outside, loud, jarring. At first, it's impossible not to notice. And then, after a minute or two, something interesting happens. That sound out there is still there, but it fades. It can fade into the background. But now, say you're stuck in traffic, or standing in a long line, or a child screaming, and suddenly the suffering again feels immediate, personal, almost unbearable. So, what's the difference? It's not the volume, it's not the circumstance. There's nothing inherent in the sound, in the traffic, in the line, in the child screaming that contains suffering. The difference between all of these is the mind's reaction. A sound is just a sound. A delay is just a delay. A sensation is just a sensation. But the mind doesn't stop there. The experience becomes a concept. The concept becomes a story. The story becomes irritation. This shouldn't be happening. I can't stand this. Why is this? Why is this happening to me? And now we're no longer working with sound or traffic or noise. We're working with the whole constructed reality. That's actually very instructive because what you're seeing in real time is how the mind collaborates with our experience to create suffering. The circumstance arises, the mind reacts, suffering appears. And the same thing happens with pleasant experiences also. Say you go outside to meditate, birds, soft light, a breeze that I'm feeling right now on my cheek. It feels wonderful, and that can be very supportive. A joyful mind is a good mind for practice, but even pleasant experience becomes a distraction if it triggers commentary or clinging. Oh, this is so nice, or I wish this would last. This is better than meditating inside. And now you're no longer in the present, you're evaluating. So the point is not to eliminate distractions, the point is to understand them. You can choose supportive conditions, that's fine, but whatever is already present, work with it. Don't waste energy resisting it. So the key question is always the same: what's happening in the mind? Now, someone might say, but when I walk outside, I feel more present. And that may be true. Movement, sensation, sound, all of that can help bring attention into the moment. But we have to be careful because the goal isn't to feel present because the conditions are favorable. The goal is to develop the skill of presence. If your ability to be present depends entirely on circumstances, the skill isn't yet established. Eventually, though, what we're training is the ability to place and sustain attention where we choose, with clarity, regardless of conditions and circumstances. And that's different. And this points to something important. It points to there are many experiences that resemble meditation, but you don't actually train what we care about. You can lie down, listen to calming music, feel peaceful. Is that pleasant? Yes. Is it relaxing? Yes. But have you trained mindfulness? Have you trained attention? Have you developed concentration? No. You've simply created a state that looks like the present result of practice without developing the capacities underneath it. What we're actually training are two things: First, mindful awareness. Second, we're training the ability to direct and sustain attention. Attention and mindful awareness. Mindfulness awareness is how clearly we know what's happening in our experience and how then we relate to it. Whether we can be with experience openly without interfering. That clarity exists on a spectrum. On one end, the mind is dull, foggy, barely awake. On the other end of the spectrum, the mind is sharp, clear, precise, fully present. And people touch this in moments of danger, intense focus, or high performance. Athletes call it being in the zone. Everything is vivid, clear, there's no extra thought. That gives you a sense of what the mind is capable of. And I experienced that in combat. Meditation, though, isn't about chasing that state, but it is about training the mind toward clarity rather than dullness. Clear awareness matters. The second capacity is attention. Can you place your attention on something simple like the breath? Can you keep it there? Not rigidly, not forcibly, but steadily. Without this, insight can't arise. The mind simply will skim across your experience instead of seeing it. So, calm alone isn't enough. Relaxation isn't enough. Pleasant states aren't enough. We need a mind that's both calm and clear, relaxed and alert, receptive and present. All right. And this leads to unification of the mind. The mind isn't one simple thing, it's many, many processes happening simultaneously. Many agendas are going on. Say you sit down, okay? One part says focus, another part says bored, another part says my knee hurts, another part says what is the conversation I'm going to have with my wife, and then you plan it out. Okay? That's not failure. That is actually revelation. Over time, practice brings these disparate parts slowly into alignment, but not by suppression, but by coherence. When the mind unifies, calm naturally arises, energy arises, often joy arises. Not because you're chasing joy, but because the inner conflicts quiet down. Joy isn't the goal, though. Energy isn't the goal. They're simply signs. What we're really training, what this practice is really about, is a mind capable of seeing clearly how it's creating suffering and how it ends. And the method is simple: intention, attention, forgetting, remembering, returning. 5 things over and over and over. You set the intention, all right? Say to pay attention to the breath. You rest attention gently there on the breath. You forget, you remember, and then you return with kindness. 1 time, 10 times, 10,000 times, 10 million times, over and over again. That's the training. And over time, the mind learns how to settle, how to unify, how to see. And that's where the path really begins. So next, let's go into unification and joy, how this becomes the foundation for insight and in awakening. Okay, let's stay with this idea of unification of the mind, because it's one of the most important pieces of the path. and also one of the most misunderstood. When people hear about calm, energy, or joy arising in meditation, it's very easy to start orienting toward those experiences as the goals, as if our practice is about manufacturing a particular internal state. But that's not what's happening. Those experiences are effects of the path. They arise when certain conditions are present. And the condition that matters most here is unification of the mind. When the mind is divided, when it's at war with itself, when different mental processes are pulling and pushing in different directions, we experience that as restlessness, fatigue, dissatisfaction, fear, worry, anxiety, frustration, shame, you name it. Those are merely words to express the disunification taking place. Even when nothing is obviously wrong, there's a kind of friction going on, a sense of background lackness. And when the mind begins to unify, something starts to shift. The very first thing that most people notice is energy in the body, but not stimulation, not agitation, but aliveness, a, a collectedness, a sense that the mind has come online. And now that makes sense. If the same amount of mental energy is no longer scattered across competing agendas taking place, but is allowed to move together in one direction, it will feel like there's more energy. Nothing new is being created, though. It's actually what's happened is that energy has been gathered. Along with that, joy naturally arises. Something beautiful happens, sometimes quietly, sometimes very clearly. Not because you're doing something special, but because inner conflict has temporarily been reduced. This is important to understand. Happiness doesn't come from getting what we want. Happiness comes from wanting what we're getting. And you can see this very clearly in daily life. Think about it. When are you happiest? Usually when you're fully absorbed in an activity. When the mind has become through an activity coherent. When the mind and heart are not divided against itself. So imagine this. Imagine you've never been to the Grand Canyon. You've never seen it, you've never heard of it, and yet you find yourself having arrived at the edge of the Grand Canyon at dawn. And suddenly you open your eyes, and instantly the mind unifies. Everything stops. And from the body, without effort, there's a sound. Ah, that sound tells you what just happened in here and in here. No striving, no evaluation, just unification, awe, aliveness. Meditation trains that same unification deliberately without needing the Grand Canyon or danger or special circumstances. Now, in traditional teachings, there are stages of practice, and those maps can be helpful, but they can also become distractions if we treat those stages as benchmarks. But one thing is worth naming here. At a certain point, unification becomes more stable. Attention gathers more easily. It stays with the object without constant effort. And when that happens, energy and joy tend to just arise more reliably. And this isn't awakening, this isn't insight, this is preparation. It's the mind becoming workable. So think of it, think of it this way. If you want to examine something closely, you need steadiness and light. If your hands are shaking and the room is dark, you won't see much. Unification provides the steadiness. Mindfulness, mindful awareness provides the light. Together, they make insight possible. And this is why we're not practicing for pleasant experiences. Those, those come and go. They're impermanent. What we're practicing to develop is a mind capable of seeing clearly enough to uproot ignorance. To, I'll put this more in simple words, we're training and developing a mind capable of undoing the conditioning that actually creates all of our suffering. The, the Buddha didn't teach meditation as a way to feel better. He taught it as a way to see more clearly, to see impermanence, to see how suffering is constructed, to see how this sense of self that's creating the suffering is forming. And without a unified, stable mind, that kind of seeing doesn't happen. So when joy arises, enjoy it. Don't suppress it, but don't cling to it. Don't measure your practice by it. Instead, use it. Let it support steadiness, let it support interest, let it support continued practice. And now there's another piece here that matters. Our culture, our culture trains the opposite. Okay, our culture trains the opposite of unification. We celebrate multitasking, constant stimulation, fragmented attention, rapid switching, and our devices are designed to do exactly that. And they're designed at a time, all right, to do it with a nervous system that is already overloaded. So when people sit down to meditate and find it difficult, that's not a personal failure, it's conditioning. And conditioning can be undone, but it takes time, it takes patience. This is also where motivation matters. If you practice only for yourself, there will be times when it feels frustrating or unrewarding, and it's easy to back off then. But if you hold something larger in your mind, besides for the purpose of yourself, if you understand that if your clarity and freedom ripple outward from you, that can sustain effort, not as pressure, not as obligation, but as meaning. You're not retraining your own mind. You're actually participating in the possibility of a different way of being a human being, which brings us back to where we started, the world as it is, and the possibility of it being otherwise. Change doesn't begin out there. It begins here, in this mind, in this heart, in this moment. So when you sit down to meditate, your job isn't to achieve a state. It's not to suppress thoughts. It's not to become blank or peaceful. Your job is simple. Train clarity, train stability. Notice when your attention wanders, return it gently. Notice reactions, but let them be. Over time, the mind learns. It learns how to gather itself. It learns how to rest. It learns how to see. And those conditions, when those conditions are present, insight arises on its own. But you don't force it. You don't chase it. You simply create the conditions. And that principle runs through everything we're talking about. We don't create awakening, we create the conditioning. We create the conditions. And next, all right, so next we'll look directly at how insight arises from this training, and how clearly um, we'll see how clearly to dismantle the suffering that is at its root. So now we come to the heart of it. Everything that we've been talking about so far: attention, awareness, unification, energy, joy. None of that, though, is the goal. All of that is in service of something deeper: insight. And when I say insight, I don't mean intellectual understanding. I don't mean having the right ideas or being able to explain things well. What I mean by insight is I mean seeing, seeing directly how your experience actually works. Because suffering doesn't end because we believe different things. A belief might be comforting, but beliefs are never liberating. Liberation happens when the mind stops making a very specific mistake. And that mistake is this: the mind habitually misperceives its own experience. It takes what is impermanent and treats as if it were stable. It takes what is constructed and it treats it as if it were solid. It takes what is impersonal and it treats it as if it's me or mine. And from those misperceptions, craving arises. And from craving, suffering arises. So insight isn't mystical, it's corrective. Insight corrects the way that the mind is seeing. Now, without stable attention and clear awareness, this correction can't happen. The mind simply doesn't stay with experience long enough to see what is actually there. But when the mind is unified, when attention is steady, something happens, something changes. The mind begins to notice the actual nature of what's arising. Sensations arise, they change, they pass. Thoughts arise, they change, they pass. Emotions arise, they change, they pass. This doesn't sound profound. Everyone knows things change, but knowing that conceptually is very different from seeing it directly, moment by moment, again and again in your own experience. And when impermanence is seen directly, something else becomes obvious. If something if something is constantly changing, it can't provide lasting satisfaction. You might enjoy it, you might prefer it, but you cannot rely on it. And this doesn't just apply to pleasure and pain. It applies to your very identity itself. Thoughts about who you are arise. Feelings of self arise. Roles, stories, memories arise. For a long time, my dominant experience of myself was shame, not as a passing emotion, not as an occasional mood. That shame was a baseline sense of who I was. That shame lived in the body: tight chest, collapsed posture, a constant background feeling of being fundamentally wrong. And before that, well, simultaneously is that there was rage at what I'd seen, rage at what I'd done, rage at what I couldn't undo. That rage had nowhere to go, so it turned inward. And when rage turns inward, it becomes shame. It became a story about my past, moments frozen in time, decisions that couldn't be changed. And every time that story replayed, the shame reassembled itself as if it were solid, as if it were me. But when I started to observe this carefully, something became clear. The rage arose dependent upon conditions. The shame arose dependent upon thinking. The sense of self arose dependent upon memory and interpretation. It wasn't a thing, it was an event. It would arise, it would persist, and if I didn't feed it, it would dissolve, and then it would arise again. And when I stayed with that process, really stayed with it, what became obvious was that my sense of self that I'd been protecting and condemning and trying to fix wasn't an entity. It was a pattern, a process unfolding in time. And when you observe identity this way, honestly and carefully, you see that it follows the same rules as everything else. It arises dependent upon conditions. It persists briefly, it dissolves. This is deeply, it can be deeply unsettling at first because so much of our suffering is organized around protecting a sense of self that feels solid and continuous. So when insight begins to show that this solidity is an illusion, fear can arise, resistance can arise. And that's why clarity and steadiness matter. Without them, insight can insight can feel destabilizing rather than freeing. But when the mind is prepared, insight does something remarkable. Insight loosens the grip of craving, or or more accurately, insight allows craving to loosen its grip on you. And you can actually feel this happening in real time. There's wanting taking place, there's tightening, there's urgency. And as insight is applied gently, clearly, the contraction begins to soften. The grip weakens, the urgency drains out. Not because you forced it, but because not because you suppressed it, but because the mind no longer believes its own misinterpretation. If you see clearly that an experience can't give you what you're seeking, craving weakens naturally. If you see clearly that resisting unpleasant sensation only adds suffering, resistance loses its force. This isn't a moral change, it's actually a perceptual one, and the Buddha laid it out precisely. Suffering arises because of craving. Craving arises because of ignorance. So when ignorance ends, craving ends. When craving ends, suffering ends. Ignorance here doesn't mean stupidity, it means not seeing clearly. So insight isn't about improving your personality, it's actually about removing ignorance. And this unfolds gradually, layers loosen, patterns weaken, the direction becomes more clear. The mind begins to trust experience as it is. The mind stops trying to manipulate reality in order to feel okay. Because pain still happens, loss still happens, difficulty still happens, but the extra layer, the resistance, that inner war begins to dissolve. And that's what freedom actually looks like. Not a perfect life, not constant bliss, but a mo- but a mind no longer at war with experience. And this matters far beyond the cushion that we're practicing on, because a mind less driven by craving and aversion behaves differently. That mind responds rather than reacts. It's willing, well, it's less willing to harm others for its own comfort. When suffering ends within an individual, it doesn't stop there. It changes how that person participates in the world. Liberation isn't withdrawal, it's clarity. And clarity naturally expresses itself as care, as restraint, as wisdom, not as ideology, not as rules, but as understanding. So next we'll bring this into very practical guidance. How to practice without getting lost, how to work with difficulty, and how to avoid misunderstandings that can derail people who are on this path. So let's now talk about something very, very practical. Why so many people start the path, practice sincerely, and then stall out or drift away. Because this happens a lot. It happens often. And it's not because people are lazy. It's not because they're incapable. It's because there are very common misunderstandings about what practice actually is. One of the one of the biggest misunderstandings is the idea that meditation is about having a certain experience: calm, peace, silence, bliss, insight. And then, without even realizing it, people start checking their experience against that internal standard. I did this. I did this relentlessly. I would sit down carrying memories I didn't want, images, scenes, faces, decisions, and underneath it all was a quiet agenda taking place. Was there less irritation today? Did I sit past without the memory of that child that died? Did did my memory about torture in a basement prison cell, did it show up or not? Was I performing better than I did yesterday? Why do I feel tighter now than I did last time? And without meaning to, meditation it started to become a way of trying to get rid of something. If the sit felt quieter, I thought I was progressing. If the memories stayed away, I thought I was succeeding. But if they came back, I thought I was failing. And that turned my practice into performance. And the moment that practice becomes performance, suffering is already being created, because now the mind is divided once again. One part's observing, another part's evaluating, another part's judging, another part's striving. That fragmentation is the opposite of what we are cultivating. So here's something very important to understand. There's no such thing as a bad meditation. There are only meditations when you're seeing clearly what's happening, and meditations where you don't. If you sit down and the mind is restless, distracted, agitated, flooded with difficult memories, that's not failure. That's the mind revealing itself. And that revelation is the practice. The mistake is thinking that we're seeing that what we're seeing is a problem to eliminate rather than information to understand. Another misunderstanding is thinking that practice should always feel good. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. As awareness sharpens, you may start to notice patterns of tension, resistance, or dissatisfaction that were always there but previously unnoticed. For me, as things got quieter, the memories actually started to get louder, more vivid, less diffuse. And that was terrifying. It felt like I was actually getting worse. But again, that's not regression. That's clarity. You're not becoming more reactive by your meditation. You're becoming more aware of reactivity that's always going on. And those are very different things. Another common misunderstanding is trying to force progress, trying to focus harder, trying to suppress memories of war, trying to manufacture insight. I did all of that. I tried to outrun memory with concentration. I tried to bury images with calm. I tried to use meditation as an anesthesia, and it will always backfire because effort applied in the wrong way increases tension, and tension obscures clarity. The effort the effort here that we're talking about is gentle and consistent, returning attention, noticing distraction, allowing experience. And that's not heroic, that's not dramatic, but it is patient. This is also where people get confused about the stages of practice. They hear about deeper states, they hear about absorption, they hear about awakening, and they start orienting toward that end instead of what is happening right now in their experience. But the path doesn't unfold by chasing results. The path unfolds by understanding causes. You don't aim for insight. You aim for clear seeing. You don't aim for calm. You aim for steadiness. You don't aim for unification. You create the conditions that allow unification to arise on its own. And this brings us right back to something that we touched on earlier. Practice isn't about controlling our experience. It's about relating to experience differently. When something pleasant arises, don't cling to it. When something unpleasant arises, we practice not resisting it. When something neutral arises, we practice not getting bored and restless, looking for things that are pleasant and unpleasant. Instead, you notice, you allow, you learn. And this is where the real work is, because the habits of clinging and resistance, those are deeply conditioned ways of being. We inherited them. They've been reinforced over our lifetime. So of course they don't disappear overnight. And this is why continuity matters. Short bursts of practice followed by long gaps don't allow the mind to recondition itself. Consistency matters more than intensity. 10 minutes every day is better than 2 hours twice a week. Because what we're doing is we're retraining the mind how to be, not trying to have a particular experience. And there's one more thing here that often gets overlooked. Practice isn't separate from the rest of your life. If meditation only exists on the cushion, it won't transform your mind and heart. The patterns that you see in meditation are the same patterns that show up everywhere else: impatience, aversion, wanting, self judging. Meditation just makes them easier to see. For me, the memories didn't only arise when I sat down. Those difficult memories came up all day long. Driving, standing in line, in conversation, being with my children, in the silence of my bedroom at night. And because I reacted to them, I fought them, I judged them, I antidoted them with countless forms of activities and drugs. They slowly begin to constrict my life. So practice became learning to meet those memories whenever they arose, to notice the tightening, to notice the story, the emotional surge, but not to interfere with them, not suppressing them, not indulging them, not analyzing them, simply the practice of allowing them, waiting in line, having a difficult conversation, feeling disappointment, feeling praise. Each moment became an opportunity to see how my suffering was being created or released. And that's where this path comes alive, not as a technique, but as a new way of being in the world. And this is also where many people quietly give up, because this practice asks something very simple but very challenging: honesty. Seeing what actually is happening, not what we wish was happening, and then staying with that. This isn't meant to be harsh. It's meant to be realistic. This path is doable. It's human. It's grounded. But it does require that we stop trying to escape our experience and to start understanding it. And that's not comfortable. This is why community matters. This is why guidance really matters. This is why clear teaching matters. And that's what we're doing here together. So let's just pause there. All right, because then we're gonna talk about diligence and doubt and motivation, and how to sustain this practice. Let's go back to about talking about something that everyone encounters, that I encountered on the path, whether they talk about it or not, and that's doubt. Not philosophical doubt, not healthy skepticism, but a quieter kind of doubt. is this really working? Am I doing this right? Maybe this just isn't for me. Maybe I'm just not made for it. Other people seem to be progressing faster. This kind of doubt doesn't usually show up all at once. It seeps in. It looks like loss of interest, irregular practice, a subtle way of pulling away. And if we don't understand it, it quietly derails the whole process of, of becoming a better human being. So let's start with something important. Doubt isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a conditioned mental process, just like craving, just like aversion. It arises for understandable reasons. One reason is that progress is on this path, it's not linear. There are periods where practice feels clear, steady and encouraging. There are periods where it feels flat, confusing, and difficult. If you expect constant improvement, doubt will arise the moment reality doesn't match that expectation. Another reason that doubt arises is that this practice begins to undermine the very strategies that the mind has relied upon to feel safe, to be in control. As, as insight deepens, familiar reference points loosen. Old ways of orienting don't work the same anymore. And when that happens, the mind reacts with uncertainty. And this isn't failure, it's proximity. The mind is encountering something unfamiliar. Therefore, this is where diligence matters. Not grit, not forcing yourself to push through, but a steady willingness just to keep showing up. Diligence here means continuing to practice even when practice doesn't feel rewarding. Not because you're chasing a payoff in the future, but because you understand the value of retraining the mind and heart. And here's something crucial. If you frame your practice as self improvement, you'll burn out because self improvement is fueled by dissatisfaction. It starts from the assumption that something is wrong with me. This path doesn't start there. This path starts from the recognition that suffering arises from misunderstanding, not from a personal failure. We're not trying to become better people. We're trying to see what is true more clearly. And clarity naturally changes behavior. So when the doubt arises, instead of asking, is this working? Try asking something else. What is happening right now? What does doubt feel like in my body? What thoughts are present? What sensations? In other words, doubt becomes the practice. And when you do that, something, at least in my experience, something interesting happens. Doubt loses its authority. It becomes just another experience arising and then passing away, rather than a verdict about the practice. The same is true for boredom, discouragement, frustration, and patience. Those aren't obstacles, they're our teachers. But if we stop arguing with them and start observing them, that's the practice. Now Motivation also needs to be addressed. Early on, for me, motivation often came up from suffering. People practice because something is hurting. That's okay. But over time, motivation needs to mature. For me, it shifts from I want relief to I value clarity. And that's a big transition because clarity doesn't always feel pleasant, but it is always freeing. And this is where remembering the larger context helps. You're not practicing to feel better, you're practicing to understand reality. And understanding reality has consequences. It changes how you respond to pain. It changes how you relate to others. It changes how you participate in the world. So when practice feels difficult, it helps to remember why you're here, not as a story you tell yourself, but as a lived intention. Be less reactive. Be less driven by craving and aversion. To suffer less. To cause less suffering. That's enough. You don't need to feel inspired every day. You don't need certainty. You just need a willingness to keep showing up, a willingness to sit, a willingness to notice, a willingness to learn. And one more thing, be kind to yourself in this process. Not indulgent, not dismissive, patient. This training unfolds slowly, gradually, over time. And I'm still deep in the midst of that unfolding, like everyone else. You, you didn't learn your habits overnight, so you won't unlearn them overnight either. And that's okay. This path isn't about fixing yourself, it's about understanding what's already happening. And that's understanding given time. That understanding given time is what's doing the work. So, we need to talk about, if you got a few more moments, we need to talk about something that often gets misunderstood or skipped over entirely: ethics. And the reason it gets misunderstood is that when people hear the word ethics, they immediately think of rules, morality, shoulds and should nots. But that's not what, in this path, what ethics is pointing to. In this tradition, ethics is not imposed from the outside. It's not about trying to become virtuous according to a legalistic set of ideals, thou shall and thou shall nots. It's about what naturally happens when the mind and heart starts to see things more clearly. When greed weakens, behavior changes. When aversion weakens, behavior changes. When confusion weakens, behavior changes. Not because you're trying to be good, but because certain actions simply stop making sense. When the mind is driven by craving, it will justify harm. We see that right now in our world. When the mind is driven by aversion, ill will, it will rationalize cruelty. When the mind is confused, it will act out blindly. But as insight develops, those forces lose their momentum. We begin to feel the consequences of actions more directly, not as guilt, not as fear, but as understanding. as understanding. You begin to see that harming others agitates the mind. You see that dishonesty fragments attention. You see that exploitation reinforces separation. And because the practice is about unification and clarity, something that creates fragmentation becomes less attractive. This is why ethical conduct supports meditation, and meditation supports ethical conduct. They're not separate trainings, they are reinforcing each other. The mind entangled in remorse or justification doesn't settle easily. A mind that is settled doesn't want to create remorse. So ethics ethics emerges naturally in the process of this alignment. And this matters because when ethics is framed as obligation, it often produces repression and hypocrisy. People try to behave in ways that don't match their actual understanding. But when ethics arise from insight, it's effortless. You don't have to convince yourself not to put your hand on a hot stove. You just simply understand the consequences. In the same way as insight deepens, as the mind gradually is reconditioned away from its habitual patterns of greed and aversion, certain behaviors naturally just start to fall away on their own. And new, more skillful behaviors start to naturally arise in their place. This doesn't mean perfection. We will always still make mistakes, but you learn from them. You notice more quickly when action is rooted in craving and aversion. You feel the dissonance sooner. You adjust. And this is how practice moves off the cushion and into our daily life. Every interaction becomes part of the path. Conversations, work decisions, family dynamics, conflict. Each moment reveals something about this mind and this heart. Where am I noticing grasping? Where am I noticing resistance? Where am I noticing confusion? And the practice isn't to fix those moments, it's to see them. Seeing precedes change. This is why liberation doesn't remove us from the world. It actually places us fully smack dab in the middle of it. A reactive mind is defensive, a clear mind, responsive. And the more reactive the world becomes, the more clarity matters. So earlier we talked about the state of this world right now, the suffering that arises when greed and aversion operate at massive scales. That can feel overwhelming to a lot of people. But this path was never about fixing that world directly. It was about transforming the conditions within this world that creates this suffering, and those conditions are right here in this mind, in this heart, in this moment. When one person becomes less reactive, it affects others. When one person responds with greater clarity instead of compulsion, it changes the field around them. This isn't abstract. This is actually how change happens. Not through ideology, not through force, through understanding, through insight. That's why this is called insight meditation. And this brings us to something important about responsibility. You're not responsible for saving the world, but you are responsible for your own mind and heart. And that's not a small responsibility, because the way you meet experience matters, the way you relate to pain matters, the way you act from clarity or confusion matters. And when people take that responsibility seriously, something real begins to shift. Not perfectly, not all at once, but meaningfully. And that brings us to the final piece. How this work that we are on right now is carried forward, how it's transmitted, and why at this point in history it belongs to people living ordinary lives right where they are in the world. Because that's where all of this suffering will start to end. So let's bring this home. Everything that we've been talking about points to one direction, not toward theory, not toward identity, not toward becoming someone special, toward responsibility. This work can't remain abstract. It can't remain idealized. It can't remain someone else's responsibility, because the dysfunction that we are seeing in this world, in this country, in this administration, the polarization, the cruelty, the fear, the reactivity, the grasping for power, the inability to listen, the endless us versus them, that's not coming from nowhere. It's the expression of what's happening in the minds and hearts of individual human beings. Scaled up, though, amplified, given permission and momentum. This country isn't broken in some abstract way. The world isn't sick in isolation. What we're seeing out there is the same greed, aversion, fear, and confusion that I've been talking about all along, that's playing itself out in here, but it's become visibly apparent collectively. And that leads to something sobering. The only place that this actually changes is here, in the individual mind, in the individual heart. For a long time, the assumption was that liberation belonged to monastics. That if you really wanted to go all the way, you stepped out of life and you went into a monastery. And that made sense in that historical context, but we're not living in that context anymore. The pace of our life has changed. The scale of suffering has changed. The reach of our actions has changed. And the need for clarity has never been greater. So the future of this path doesn't lie primarily in withdrawal. It lies in integration. It lies in people who are living ordinary lives, doing ordinary things, retraining their minds to be less driven by greed, aversion, and confusion. And this is where it's important to be very honest about what we are working with. From an evolutionary perspective, the human nervous system was shaped for survival, not for wisdom. We inherited brains optimized to detect threat, secure resources, protect status, dominate when necessary. You don't have to believe me. You just need to turn on the TV. Those traits helped us survive. They also gave us the capacity to dominate every other life form on the planet. They gave us the capacity to extract without limit, to treat difference as threat, to prioritize short-term gain over long-term consequence. That conditioning lives deep in the nervous system, in threat circuits, in habit loops, in reflexive us versus them thinking. And at this point in history, those same survival adaptations are now threatening our own survival. But here's the part that matters. We didn't just inherit that conditioning. We've also inherited something else. We've inherited an extraordinary capacity for learning, for neuroplasticity, for reconditioning, for insight to shape, for insight to reshape instinct. Modern brain science is very clear about this. The brain is not fixed. Patterns of fear, aggression, reactivity are learned, reinforced, and can be unlearned. And not through ideology, not through force, through attention, through awareness, through training, which means we have the capacity not just to heal personal suffering, but to outgrow the most primitive aspects of our inheritance. In other words, we have an unlimited capacity to become a better species. And the leverage point for that isn't out there. It's in here, with you, with me. Which means this is no longer about your or my own liberation. Not because you owe the world something, not because I should carry some heavy burden, but because the only change you can reliably make is the one that happens here. When you stop feeding greed here, when you stop acting from aversion here, when you stop being compelled by the fear here, something real changes. And that change doesn't stay contained. You start to listen differently, you speak differently, you disagree differently, you respond under pressure differently. Not because you're trying to influence anyone, but because the inner conditions have started to shift. And people notice, not because that you tell them what to do, but because something in you is no longer reacting in the same way. This is how transmission actually works. Not through authority, not through ideology, not through charisma, through embodiment. And that's why this work now belongs to people like you. People willing to practice seriously. People willing to examine their own minds honestly. People willing to stay when it's uncomfortable. Not necessarily to become better teachers in a formal sense, but to become stable, clear, less reactive, more loving, more compassionate, more joyful, more equanimous human beings. And that asks something of us. We have to understand the path clearly enough to walk it ourselves. and clearly enough to speak about it without distorting it, not by copying forms, not by repeating language, but by understanding causes and conditions. Why does suffering arise? Why does the suffering that the mind is creating persist? What weakens it? What strengthens it? If we don't understand those things, the path becomes confused, diluted. People struggle unnecessarily and they will give up. Not because the path doesn't work, but because it hasn't been made clear enough. So, this is our project, to practice deeply, observe carefully, to, to learn from our own experience, to listen to others and their experiences, to notice what helps, to notice what hinders, and to refine how we practice and how we speak about the practice. Not to simplify the path in a way that weakens it, but to clarify it in a way that makes it livable. This isn't about inventing something new, it's about removing confusion. And if we do that, something remarkable becomes possible. Change doesn't start out there, it starts here in how this mind meets the experience it's having, how this heart responds to the pain it's experiencing. And when that changes, the ripple is real. So that's the orientation I want to hold as we continue on this path together. We practice to be free, and we practice because a freer mind participates differently in the world, not someday, not abstractly, but right here, from this mind, from this heart, in this world, as it is right now. Thanks for listening.